we've been following the Holy Spirit through the book of Acts. I don't know if you've noticed or not, but I have consistently used female pronouns for the Holy Spirit. And I've been a little bit surprised that it hasn't gotten much of a reaction or a response. I haven't gotten angry emails or anonymous notes in my box. And I only hope it's because that this is not a new thing for you, that you have heard this before. Because hearing a preacher call the Spirit a she from behind a pulpit had a profound effect on me when I heard it for the very first time. And it wasn't that long ago. It was at the first church that I served at in Dallas. A resident colleague of mine was preaching. It might have been on Pentecost. I'm not sure of the exact day. But he was saying something about the nature of the Spirit. How wouldn't it be nice if the Spirit moved in orderly and predictable ways that didn't challenge us too much? And he ended with a question. After saying all this about wouldn't it be nice if the Spirit was like this, he said, but that's not what she's like, is it? And he let that question hang in the air for just a moment, letting it sink in, letting us consider the nature of the Spirit, but all that I had heard was that one word, she. And it pricked my heart and it brought tears to my eyes. Because while I had read lots of theology in college and even more in divinity school, this was the first time that someone behind a pulpit had used language that included me in the nature of God. I'd never heard that before. Because while we claim that he is a universal word, that it's all-inclusive or even non-gendered, it's just simply not true. It doesn't sound true. And this was a deficiency that I didn't know I had, or that any of us had, until this colleague of mine dared to identify a person of the Holy Trinity with the word she. And how powerful that was. Now, this colleague of mine didn't randomly decide to make the Spirit a she on a whim just to be provocative or to get a rise out of the congregation. There's a whole history and a tradition of the Spirit being personified as a woman. And part of that tradition comes from passages like the one we just read, that we just heard from Proverbs. Doesn't wisdom call? Doesn't understanding raise her voice? She calls to everyone, men and women. In this chapter, the writer personifies wisdom as a woman and gives her a voice, which she uses to declare how she was present with God from the very beginning. I have been from everlasting in the beginning before the world began, she says. When the foundation of the earth was laid out, I was the skilled artisan standing next to the Almighty. In this beautiful recitation of her relationship to God and creation, we hear the echoes of what happened all the way back there at the very beginning. When the earth was without form, when darkness covered the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. We hear how she was that Spirit hovering over the waters, how she was there from the beginning, how she has been part of the dance and the music that has been spinning creation into being from the very beginning. And we hear how she still calls to us today, but not always from the places that we would expect. Because if you think about wisdom, right, think about where wisdom comes from. We often think that it only comes to a select few of us, those few who are willing to read dusty, old, thick books or study under wise old teachers. That's not what we hear in the words of Proverbs this morning. What's cool in this passage from Proverbs is that we hear how wisdom calls to us all along the roads and where different paths meet. How she stands at the entrance to the city and cries to us from the gates. It's cool that wisdom is present at these crossroads in our lives where our paths intersect with others and we meet others on the way. That she meets us on the road as we journey from one place to another. Wisdom can be found. And that she's waiting for us at all these times of transitions in the gateways of our lives. She cries out to us all, not just to a select few. Wisdom is there, waiting to be found. Proverbs tells us that wisdom is at work in the everydayness of our lives if our hearts are tuned to receive her words of encouragement and guidance and joy and delight. That's her. In all of her glory, that's the Holy Spirit as the embodiment of divine wisdom. But it still begs the question of, so what? What does it matter that we have a feminine personification of the divine? And why should I make a big deal of it, especially on today of all days when we come together to celebrate Father's Day? Right? Of all days, this should be the day where we couch God in terms of father and masculine language. Well, I'm glad you asked. Because I'm going to tell you. Highlighting a feminine personification of the divine doesn't solve the problem of couching God in masculine terms that we've been in the practice of doing for the past several millennia, which I'll get to in a minute. What it does do is make us aware that there's a problem, and it opens us up to receive a deeper understanding of God, a better understanding of ourselves, and a healthier way of relating and connecting with others. Because as I said before, I myself wasn't aware of any deficiency in my understanding of God or myself until this colleague of mine used language that connected with how I inhabit the world. Language that made me feel for the first time that I am made in the image of the divine. Now, since that moment, I make a point to read from a translation of the Bible, if you haven't noticed, that doesn't ever use any gendered language for God. And if you've noticed, or if you've talked to Sue, I drive her crazy sometimes. When we meet to pick hymns for a service, I want to make changes to alter those masculine language for God. To crack open how we see and understand and relate to God so that we can crack open a little bit ourselves. Because how we speak about God affects how we relate to God. And how we relate to God affects how we understand ourselves. And how we understand ourselves affects how we relate to others. It's all connected. And the reverse is also true. How we understand ourselves and relate to others informs our relationship and our understanding of God. So the problem of using male language for God becomes one of association. In her book, Beyond God the Father, theologian Mary Daly makes the famous claim that if God is male, then male is God. And this is where the trouble lies. Because even though we've done it unconsciously, we've internalized a male image of God, and thus we've conflated maleness with godness. And this is a problem, not just for those of us who aren't male, but for everyone. And I'll tell you why. This belief that God is male and then male is then God is why we have a hierarchical, unbalanced social system that oppresses those on the bottom and creates unrealistic expectations for those on the top. The system, called patriarchy, is a hierarchical power structure that favors men, but really is detrimental to us all. This is not a men are evil sermon. Don't hear that. That's often the mistake we make when we hear the word patriarchy. It's important to note that while the system favors men, men aren't bad or evil just because they benefit from this unbalanced system. Like I said, sometimes calling out patriarchy is misunderstood as saying all men are bad. But conflating maleness with evil is just as bad as conflating maleness with God. Calling out patriarchy, understanding it, isn't about showing how this system doesn't benefit anyone. Doesn't benefit anyone. Even those who are at the top, even those who seem like they are benefiting. Because sure, it may seem that men benefit, right? That's just on the surface, though. It's just in the short run. Men may make more money than women do. They may occupy more positions of power. They have more seats at the table. This is all true, but at what cost? If God is male and male is God, then maleness comes with the expectation of being all-knowing, all-powerful, all-successful, all-together, all-everything. Or at least trying to appear like you have it all together, no matter what it takes or what it costs. In her book, Daring Greatly, Brene Brown argues that under patriarchy, men have been taught to hide their vulnerability, their weaknesses, and even their shame in order to keep up a facade of strength and power. This is a system that hurts us all. How can you relate to God and be vulnerable before your Maker if you're worried about keeping it all together, of being a success? See, under patriarchy, success is measured by productivity. Value is assessed by dollar signs. Problems are solved through deception. Opponents are dealt with through violence, and control is maintained by fear and by force. This is not a healthy system. Beloved of God, this is not who God created you to be. This is not the fullness of life that God desires for you. And it's why it's important to highlight this feminine personification of the divine on Father's Day of all days. I told you I would answer the question, right? This feminine personification of the divine, she breaks open our limited perception of God, and she brings balance to our idea of the divine. She calls us into a deeper relationship with the one who created us, in whose image we are made. And she frees us. She frees us all to live into the fullness of life that God desires for us. She moves and breathes and lives in us. Time and time again throughout the book of Acts, we saw how the Holy Spirit called the apostles to cross all kinds of boundaries. They went to different countries. They crossed seas. They crossed geopolitical lines. They transgressed socioeconomic boundaries. They traversed ethnic divides, gender divides, and even religious divides. Time and time again, we saw the Holy Spirit move across boundaries. She called the apostles to release their narrow understanding of who was included and welcomed to take part in the good news of God's love made real in the world. And just as she called them back then, she calls us now. We heard in the words of Proverbs, wisdom invites us to embrace a deeper understanding of God and the beautiful world that has been entrusted into our care. Not to dominate it, not to exploit it, but to care for it. So, on this day of all days that we set apart to honor the gift of fathering love, and a day that often also happens to be Trinity Sunday, if you read the weekly email, it is good and it is fitting for us to open our hearts to hear wisdom's call, to release our limited perception of God and to embrace a more expansive image of God that includes all expressions of gender identities. And so, to honor fathers to be equal, since I gave a small thing to women on Mother's Day, I have a small token for men. Now, who remembers what the women got on Mother's Day? Barb. A little piece of cloth, right? We heard the story of Tabitha Dorcas who sewed for widows. So I gave all the women a small piece of cloth that was, as I admitted, more symbolic than useful. It had no use. It was not delicious. So it was a challenge to come up with something as useless for men. I wanted to keep things equal. So it is more symbolic than useful. But I think I got it. And I left them over here. So I'm going to go get them. This is what I came up with. So, for all of you handy people out there, do you know what this is? What is it? I heard it. A shim. Look, handy right there. Gold star. College educated, right there. A shim. All right. And what is a shim used for? What is it? Leveling, yeah. Keep things open. It has a plethora of uses. It fills in small gaps. It levels things out. And what better symbol of who we are, right? We all have gaps. We all have uneven places. But it's in these places where we can let the Spirit of God move and breathe new life into us. So, what I also did is each shim has a unique prayer and a unique challenge. No two are the same, because no two of you are the same. So, it is my hope and it is my prayer that these speak to you on this day where we honor fathering love, where we celebrate the beauty and the balance of the Holy Trinity. To let wisdom, let the Spirit of God, let her speak and move and breathe in you. So, as we stand and sing, receive this gift.